Enjoy with your headphones for a better listening experience.
Please watch till the end of the video to have the most scariest part of the story.
Truck drivers, what's a creepy story you've got from the middle of nowhere? Episode 7. I was never a truck driver, but I drive from my college through 3 hours of country and wilderness to take care of my grandparents on the weekends. COVID wrecked their ability to leave. You get to see some scary things on the roads at night. On to a creepy story. I once almost hit a cat along the road once, so I slowed down to around 20 mph to make sure I didn't kill it. It was dark and it jumped out of nowhere, so I stopped for a minute. I'm no man of superstition, but a black cat jumping out of nowhere is a bit suspicious at near midnight. It was a relatively large one too, quite a bit bigger than a house cat. Then it started running and I stopped to see it round the corner of the house. At this point, I was bored and tired and just wanted to see something interesting. Then I heard a loud shriek, I assume a woman, but you really can't tell. That was then getting distorted and then silent and then 3 gunshots. I got scared because I was in the middle of nowhere, East Texas, and I know fully well that unsure thing occurs out here, so I took off as fast as I could in the car. I almost hit the metal curve on a bend looking out my rearview mirror. Lo and behold, the same, or at least a similar, cat was there along the side of the road where I stopped. I always take a different route going to their house now. It's 15 minutes longer, but I feel much safer taking the highway than a dark, overgrown, one-lane road. Not a truck driver, just a traveler. I live in an exceedingly small town in Utah. You have to drive an hour to get anything done. We had just brought our cattle off of a range that used to be a reservation for Paiutes. After counting, it was determined there were 7 calves missing. Sometimes we miss a few, so that wasn't odd. I set off in the Jeep to find our missing cattle. It was 9 a.m. and I didn't pack lunch thinking I'd head up to the place we call the res and spot the cattle and let our hands know where they were. It was a pretty drive, and I was having an enjoyable time. The road is certainly a Jeep trail and there is not another person within 180 miles or so, besides the farm an hour away. I enjoy the peace and quiet of the area, so for me I was rather happy about spending some time up there. Not paying much attention, I realized that the road was completely unfamiliar. I know this road very well, so this was odd. At this point it was about 10:40 a.m. and I should have reached the pasture gates by now. I pressed on in the Jeep thinking I just forgot this part of the road. Looking out the window, I noticed maybe 40 or 50 crows that were just sitting in the trees along the road. This was very odd. It's normal to see a few, but I haven't ever seen this many in a group. I stopped thinking maybe this is where a calf had died or been killed by a coyote, and that's why the crows were there. When I climbed out of the Jeep, every hair on my neck jumped up. Oddly, the birds were silent and didn't fly away in my presence like usual. The place was very unsettling, but I shook it off and walked off the road to look around for tracks. I had only stepped off the road of about 20 paces when I looked back at the Jeep. Its blue shine was gone. Thinking perhaps it was a tree blocking my view, I stepped back into my tracks looking for the road and my Jeep. The tracks were there, but the road and the Jeep were gone. Now I was only 20 paces off the road, so it should have been impossible to get lost, but I tracked my steps and they just kept going and going. I sat down for a moment to try to get my bearings. The junipers and sagebrush all looked the same. Being only 25 and of a solid mind, I was puzzled by how I lost myself so quickly. I finished off the last bit of Coke in my can and tossed it in a tree. I started following my tracks again. It seemed like I had been walking for about 20 minutes. A red glint in a tree caught my eye, my Coke can. How could that be? At this point, I was really worried. I left my tracks walking quickly in a direction I thought seemed to be south, but I was properly lost, so who knows? I walked through the trees and brushed for an hour or so thinking I would come upon a clearing or hill. I never found one though. Finally, I came upon a campsite. There was an old man sitting by a fire, and I called out to him asking if he knew what direction the main road was. He quietly said, "You know that road didn't always run through here." I thought that was an odd thing to say, but brushed it off and nodded yes. He said, "Come sit down and rest a bit." I sat by the fire on a large rock and took my hat off. I said to the old man, "Hey, how did you get all the way up here anyways?" Then I heard the caw of a crow, and when my eyes looked back up, there was the Jeep and the road right where the old man had Saturday. I was pretty spooked and ran to the Jeep. Quickly, I turned around and headed back out of there. The sun was setting as I got back to the farm. I'm not sure how long I was lost out there, but I cannot account for a solid 5 hours of time. The strangest part is I went back up there the next day with a ranch hand, and we found the res pasture with no problem, even found the calves. Not a truck driver, but I saw this woman and a little girl in the airport heading my way from arrivals as I was waiting. When she was near me I noticed the kid wasn't with her, so Kay kindly mentioned that she now without the kid. She looked at me and asked me what I meant. I explained that I had seen her with the girl and now she was alone. The woman asked me what the girl looked like, and to proceed to describe the kid. The woman started to cry and told me that she was traveling alone and coming home from the funeral of her granddaughter that happened to be the age and looks of what I described. I will never forget her. I drive bale wagons for a local farm. So, it's about midnight 1 a.m. and me and my friend had been stacking for about 13 hours. This field is a rectangle, and we start on the outside going in. We made a couple rounds around, and out of nowhere, there was a metal shed in front of us. No lights on it, or anything around it, at all. We both swore it wasn't there before, and we had already been going around that field for maybe 30 minutes, needless to say, we finished the load and set it to road mode and got FT out of there. Not a truck driver, but a plumber who works across Ontario. Was driving back to Toronto from Ottawa, just got back onto the 401. There were headlights in my lane, the highway is split in the middle, so I thought someone made a serious mistake. I was swerving left and right, and the car mimicked my movements. A second before it turned into a head-on collision in the middle of nowhere, they swerved around me. I looked into my mirrors and saw the car turn around and start heading towards me. I maxed out the governor, so I'm only going about 139 kilometers per hour. Car pulls up beside me and two people leaned out holding what I can only imagine, at the time, were assault rifles of some sort. I didn't know what to do, so I kept my foot on the floor. They suddenly hit the brakes and went onto the opposite side of the highway and left me alone. My mom lived in California for a while. One time she was driving from LA to Vegas with her husband. They stopped in a town in the desert, at a diner for lunch. According to her, everyone stopped what they were doing and stared at them the entire time they were in the diner, including the people outside. Only the server and the host treated them normally. They ate their food and left, and according to her, she found out sometime later that that area of California is known to have high Satanist activity, as well as some disappearances. Well, this am not a truck story, it was just a normal car, and my dad was driving, but my family was moving from Washington to Georgia, and since it was winter in me and my mom can't do snow, we took a southern route. We were in a part of Nevada where there was absolutely nothing. No trees, no people, and the nearest gas station was over 40 miles away. It was nearly 10 p.m., and it was very dark out. We weren't in Death Valley, of course, that would probably kill us. But we were searching for a place to stay that night, and we knew a hotel would be extremely far away. At some point I saw a creepy old woman limping along the side of the road. She was limping very quickly, too, and it freaked me out. Her hair was nasty looking, and her skin was pale and wrinkly. She looked at my window, and I saw her face. It looked a lot like mine if I had given up on my life and grew like 80 years older. It might have been a hallucination because she disappeared shortly after I saw her face. I sometimes have nightmares of that lady. But now I take medicine that helps to stop nightmares. Also, all this happened shortly after my grandpa died while living with us, which was a major trauma for me. I remember the sirens and seeing his covered-up corpse being wheeled into an ambulance. I knew he was dead, despite me being only 10. Sirens still freak me out to this day, too. Not a truck driver, but I often have to drive in fairly rural areas at random times of the night for work. I was driving on a 2-lane road at like 1 a.m. which went through a forest. It wasn't too dark because there were road lights, but they were super dim and very distant from each other. I was the only one driving on the road, there was nobody behind me or in front of me for miles and no oncoming traffic either. I was driving at around 50 miles per hour until I suddenly saw something in my peripherals to the right. I looked there and there was a huge white flash like someone took a picture of me with an old-fashioned flash camera right outside of my driver's window. I couldn't see for a bit but kept driving, and once I regained my vision, the streets were exactly as I had seen them before. Not a single car in sight. I still have no clue what that flash was. A few years ago, my mom, aunt and I went on vacation to Florida. We were coming back and driving down farm roads in Texas, the middle of nowhere. It was about 2 a.m. No open gas station and we were getting low on gas. My aunt wanted a cigarette, so I pulled over at this lit-up station, closed but had lights on. There was a four-way stop and out of freaking nowhere this semi is across the street from us. My aunt doesn't have out yet cause we're waiting for the semi to go on. A guy in the passenger seat of the semi jumps out and starts coming towards us. But would get to the back of the car first. My mom and aunt were both telling me to just leave. So, I put it in the drive, ran over the curb and went 80 the whole way out of there. My mom looked back and right before we drove off, she said he was about 10 feet from the car. Still freaks me out. My dad used to drive semis, so I'll have to ask him about a creepy story later. But he freaked out for us. Not a truck driver, but a weird story. Me and my GF left North Florida at about 6 p.m. after having a weird experience at my dad's house. I hadn't been there since I was a kid, but, long story short, there were a ton of crosses, including one made of red duct tape outside the house, weirdly aggressive animals, people acting off, and we felt like we were being watched even when we were alone. About an hour and a half in, after the sun had set, we started talking about the experience. It was very bizarre because we hadn't said anything before to each other, but we both noticed a lot of weird, unsettling things. At this point, we were driving through narrow one-lane roads in the middle of the woods and sometimes farmland. I noticed I kept seeming to make wrong turns even though I never noticed when I was messing up. Eventually we stopped at a gas station in a small town for caffeine and gas. I was feeling anxious, but I knew it was in my head. Well, we got on the road again and I didn't notice that I was missing any turns. We got to a town area and, as I was driving, I noticed it looked familiar. And then I noticed we passed the same exact area with gas station. I freaked out and checked my map and we were 20 minutes closer to home. I hadn't missed a turn, but I swear it was exactly the same. I kept driving and me and my GF were making jokes about everything, but we were both nervous. I noticed even though we were supposed to be closer, it took even longer to get back than the gap said it would, and I'd noticed familiar things, but they always seemed farther than home than I remembered it being. Well, after we got back I went from barely sleeping and waking up when it was still dark to sleeping 12 hours a night and napping, and for months I had a nightmare every time I slept, even experiencing something close to sleep paralysis. Same state it happens in with hallucinations, but I could move a bit, and even when I was just taking naps. I've seen my dad and talked to him plenty of times since. He seems fine, actually more stable than I remember. So, I hope he is okay, but I have low-key prayed and lit candles for him on occasion since. Not a truck driver myself, but my coworker used to be a truck driver that delivered packages to Area 51. He accidentally drove on site before and had a number of guns trained on him. One of his friends got pulled over by a police officer at one point on the way to Area 51. The police officer wanted him to open up his crates so they could see what was in them, and the truck driver refused. He said, "Call your boss, because I'm not opening those crates. I would go to jail, and you would go to jail." When the police officer did call his boss, he just took off. Not a truck driver, but in a band that frequently tours, or did, pre-COVID, and makes a lot of long drives. I'll never forget the time that we were in the middle of nowhere, North Carolina around 3 a.m. on a completely empty highway. Suddenly, we saw a light in front of us, getting larger as we approached it. It was a car completely engulfed in flames, with nobody around for miles. I still wonder what happened. Not a truck driver, but my grandmother and uncle were going to visit my great-aunt in southeastern Oklahoma back in the early 1980s or so. It was during a snowstorm during the day, and they saw a guy walking in the same direction they were going. He had a long black coat on. My grandmother wanted to ask him if he needed a ride, but they both decided to drive on at the last minute. As my uncle looked back, the guy's face looked like shiny plastic, pale white and completely expressionless. Both described his face as like a plastic doll or like a Japanese no mask. They got to my great-aunt's house in the afternoon and told her. She said people have seen similar things along that part of the road, near Stratford, Oklahoma, both day and night. I'm not one for supernatural things, but here goes my creepiest moment driving. I was heading down to Laredo, Texas on a stretch of highway around the 3 to 4 a.m. I had the radio on listening to talking on the radio when it cut out. I heard a very human meow come from the sleeper, then as if nothing happened the radio came back in the middle of a different part of the sentence. I drove the rest of the night without daring to look in the back until I went to bed. Not a trucker and neither is my friend, but creepy story. She had a fight with her boyfriend at 2 a.m. and drove her SUV down a main road and just kept driving even after the city ended. The road stopped at a trailhead deep in the desert without lights. All the reflective signs and road markings stopped so pitch black. There's a ring of about 10 people standing in a circle, perfectly evenly spaced. If they held up their arms, they would have touched fingertips. No phones or lights or anything. She parks for a moment. They stared at her. After 10 seconds, one of them starts walking very quickly towards her. She busts out the fastest U-turn of her life and speeds back to the city. Was driving down in Texas along the Gulf and stopped at a truck stop for fuel and something to drink. Tiny place, I was bobtail and had slight problem fitting into the lot. Go inside, do my thing. Come out to a green sedan parked next to my rig and a man furiously jerking off in the driver's seat watching teammate, and I get back into the truck. I was at the time 25 and I am female. Teammate was my 45-year-old mom. Grosses. So gross. Not that I am truck driver, but that pillage princess is told by truck drivers, especially the older ones. If anyone knows the pillage forest in Australia, the vegetation is uniquely dense and scrubby. It's like looking at a wall of trees when you're there by day, despite being a pretty area for a forest. It was historically believed by Aboriginals that the Yowie lived there. Around the 1970s in the town of Narrabri, a woman and her husband, a doctor, once lived. Her husband eventually died. The woman then supposedly went crazy and was seen pushing a shopping trolley with belongings up the rural Newell Highway in the pillage forest at crazy hours of the night, like 12 a.m. to 3 a.m. She was often seen near and staying at one of the rest areas along the highway. This woman was eventually hit and killed by a truck driver on one of her late-night trolley runs. Despite this, there were multiple accounts from truck drivers who are absolutely certain they saw the same woman pushing the trolley up the highway at the same ungodly hours of the evening while driving through the pillage between Narrabri and Coonawarra. The pillage is good for stargazing though. Not a truck driver, but still. I was driving home from an event with my mom in the passenger seat in rural central PA. It was dark and we were driving through a wooded area and there was a lull in conversation. We were just driving along, no other cars, when, both of us, suddenly jolted forward in our seats. It was almost as if we'd run into something or passed through something, or maybe something passed through us, but the car didn't. My heart skipped a beat and I hit the brake to slow down. We did not hit anything. My heart was pounding, and adrenaline was coursing through me, without reason. I was afraid it was just me, or just in my head, but then my mom said, what just happened? I had no idea. We both had sensed something. After talking about it, she said, the thing is, I don't know if it was good or bad. I said, me neither. Was a delivery driver for a large store in the UK, last delivery was at 11 p.m. It was a dark October night, middle of nowhere, heading back when I decided to take the coast road back. It gets a really pleasant view of my city at night. Road is windy and has sudden turns, has a few weird places on the route that Scooby-Doo and the gang would love, abandoned castle, monk's ministry, and about 2 weeks before a crop circle in the field next to the road. I came round the corner of a small bend and in the dark of the road was a small black figure, about 3 to 4 feet tall, in what appeared to be a cloak. Just about up to it at this point, when it appeared to open its eyes, 2 orange rings, just about crashed the van. It appeared to open its cloak and flew at me, was an escaped eagle owl, flew over the top of the van, never been that scared, and Ivy had weapons, pulled at me and attacked on my roots. Not a truck driver, but I drove the US East Coast to West Coast and then summoned a Toyota older than I am for no good reason, so I feel like I earned the right to post here. There were so many ghost towns scattered across the country, just eerily empty, especially in the Midwest. A few hours east PF Kansas City I took an exit to find a snack and some gas. I came across a serious main street. Huge streets with many beautiful murals on tall brick buildings and storefronts, a bank, Everything looked like it had a fresh coat of paint, but no one was around. Maybe 3 cars parked along this entire street that went farther than I could see, was flat. I got out of my car and took some pictures and basically stood in the middle of the road and took in how surreal it was that on such a wonderful day in the late afternoon the city was just empty. Then this man shirtless, and I swear he had a mohawk, rode by on a BMX bike. I swear he and the lady that worked at the Dollar General were the only 2 people I had seen in the whole town. I still get anxious thinking about it. I left quickly despite being exhausted and low on gas, as I was listening to an audiobook at the time about a truck driver uncovering a massive conspiracy with skinwalkers lurking in the small highway towns scattered across the Midwest especially. Hit a little too hard. Might not have been the best audiobook, but it kept me staying too long anywhere I felt I should. Long ago, when I was about 6 or 7 years old, my mom used to drive from Washington to Texas so we could visit our aunt and cousins there. One night on the drive back we ended up having to slow down due to a line of cars followed by a semi-truck and a couple police officers at the end of it. Once we got close enough, my mom ordered us to put our heads down and close our eyes. You could hear the fear in her voice as she said it. I was young and curious, so I had to take a peek. Big mistake. I peeked out the window and the first thing I saw was cops guiding traffic. Nothing abnormal yet, so I proceed. Slowly moving forward, I see a semi pulled over to the side with a woman who I would assume was the driver. She was crying hysterically while a police officer was talking to her. Further down the road and I see it. A head on the side of the road, arms, legs, no torso. A homeless man was crossing the street, had been hit by the semi-truck. To this day I still remember seeing the torn face of that dismembered homeless man. I was traveling east through the cold desert in the middle of the night somewhere in southern Arizona. I had the radio off, CB and FM, for a while, just enjoying the peace and quiet. Then my brain told me something was off. Couldn't quite figure out what for a few minutes until I heard it, native chanting coming from the speakers even though everything was off. Started cold sweating until I went further down the road and saw the bug radio antenna. Gave me the chills, something fierce for a few minutes there. My dad drove a truck and wouldn't sleep for extended periods of time back in the 80s. He said he would start hallucinating from the lack of sleep and watch tall, long-legged furry creatures walking along/crossing the road. The way he described, and I remembered, would be like tall palm tree-looking creatures. He also said he saw a chupacabra at a truck stop in New Mexico. My dad has been a truck driver for the better part of the last 10 years. He used to run along the entire southern side of the U.S. before sticking to the East Coast. He told us that one night, while making a delivery in southern Texas, he took the wrong exit and got lost. So here he was, in the middle of nowhere, late at night, just reading his map, trying to find the interstate. When he noticed a small group of SUVs/trucks drive past him onto a dirt road, he didn't notice. Some guys get out of the first SUV with guns, and one of them points to his truck. Another guy starts walking his way and gestures for him to roll down the window. Being from Mexico, my dad starts to freak out because he realizes that he might be in cartel territory. The guy asked him what he was doing there, and my dad just holds up his map to show that he had gotten lost and just needed to find the interstate, and asks the man if he knew how to get there. The man gives him the directions and warns him never to come back to that area. My dad still passionately believes that he had someone watching out for him. Otherwise, he might have gotten shot. I'll start this by saying, I am a truck driver, lol. Haven't seen much creepiness, but this freaked me out. I was driving I-80 westbound in Iowa around 5 or 6 a.m. I looked over and saw another semi vertically positioned on the embankment on the opposite side of the freeway, near the top of the overpass road. Initially I thought it had been on the overpass and drifted off the road, down the embankment, until I noticed the cab was facing the overpass road, not the interstate. The semi had been westbound, crossed over the median and 2 lanes of opposing traffic, and was stopped by the upward climb of the embankment on the eastbound side of the interstate. The driver had his flashers on and there was no one around, so this had just happened. I concluded the driver must have drifted with cruise control engaged and woke up to this feat of physics defying what is that at all. Now, if I feel sleepy and need to find a place to stop, I disengage the cruise control until I can stop. I was driving a truck north of NYC in the 80s. We had been out on the route for almost 24 hours by then. My co-driver was asleep, and I was so tired I was hallucinating. Literally. I saw, with perfect clarity and great detail, a flatbed semi-trailer parked perpendicular to the highway, blocking the road. It was only my fatigue-soaked reaction time that prevented me from locking up the brakes. I blinked, and it was gone. I was shaking like a leaf. Don't drive tired, kids. Hey, truck drivers, one of your kind forced me off the road in the middle of the night on I-5, in the middle of nowhere between SF and LA. Anyone who's made this drive can attest to the vast emptiness of the long stretch of farmland that surrounds I-5 between Stockton/Vernal and Los Angeles, and how empty the road would be past midnight. 2-lane highway, middle of night, nobody on the road for hours but myself. I'm driving in the right lane and eventually a semi with an open flatbed carrying a load of enormous industrial piping appears ahead of me. The speed limit on this stretch was 65 miles per hour for trucks, 75 or 80 miles per hour for passenger vehicles. I signal, get in the left lane, and pass the truck. I get some distance from him, but I stay in the left lane because I don't want the trucker to think I've cut him off. Also, it's the middle of the night and the road is otherwise completely empty, so why not just stay in the left lane till the truck disappears behind me? After a minute or so, I check my mirrors and see that I'm no longer gaining any ground on the truck. I'm maintaining a speed of about 80 miles per hour, so he clearly started accelerating after I passed him. Well, he kept accelerating and gaining ground on me, must have been going 100 plus mph, and as soon as the cab of his truck was parallel with the front of my car, he started drifting into my lane without signaling. There wasn't a full-sized shoulder on the left side, so I ran completely off the road and into a dirt field. I drove right into a giant wooden electric line pole, and I would have been killed if I hadn't reacted as fast as I did. Thankfully, my Jeep was able to handle it and I was able to continue my journey after watching the trucker speed off at 100 plus mph. Again, no other cars or trucks were on the road. No logical reason that I can fathom for his behavior. So, truckers, why did this guy decide to run me off the road and nearly kill me? Not a truck driver but spent lots of time driving forestry roads for fun with friends. There's been a couple times we've encountered some strange things. There's one that really sticks with me though. 5 years ago, my friend and I were taking a course at a college a couple of towns over. He stayed at his grandma's place during the week because it was closer to the school, and I'd pick him up in the mornings on my way to school. His grandma's house was kind of on the outskirts of town. There was a pretty large forestry road like 10 minutes from her house that we knew about but didn't know where it led to. One night I stayed at his grandma's house with him while she was away, and we decided we would go drive this road and see what was up there. So, we're driving this road for about half an hour and come to a dead end. We get out and look around and see some strange lights up in the distance that kind of look like they're going in a circle. After factoring out that it's not a UFO, I realize it's a major highway and that the lights are actually the headlights of cars. We figured this forestry probably ends up leading to this highway, so we head back a little bit then take another road that branches off. After driving this same road for about an hour now we round this corner and I see this guy standing on the left side of the road up in the distance. For whatever reason I distinctly remember what he was wearing. He was wearing a blue t-shirt with khaki cargo shorts, and he was facing us. I say to my friend, WTF is this guy doing? He says, I don't know, probably just camping or something. As we get closer he just vanishes. Like blink of an eye and he's gone. My friend was driving, and he slows right down and doesn't say anything, and he's looking at where this guy was standing. He then looks over at me with a really worried/scared look and says, where did he go? I just shrugged, I was too creeped out to say anything. We continued on and about 5 minutes down the road we found a burnt car in the ditch. By now we're both super creeped out and hardly speak 5 words the rest of the drive. The road we were on eventually led to the highway we thought we had seen earlier. On the drive home on the highway the truck was shaking pretty badly and would randomly pull hard to the right. I put it up on the hoist the next day and took the front wheels off and found that the top ball joint on the passenger side was only held on by one of the 3 bolts. And even that bolt was barely hanging on. I just put new ball joints on that truck a week previous and used lock washers and Loctite on the bolts. There's no reason they should have loosened off that much. Thinking of that still creeps me out. My dad is a fleet owner but used to drive trucks himself if the drivers weren't available sometimes. So, one time he was driving in the hill areas of Manali, Himachal, NDIA, along with the conductor and was driving a bit faster than the limits. It was the middle of the night with only the headlights lighting up the way when suddenly my dad sees three men on bicycles and before he could do anything it was too late. My dad got scared that he just crushed those young men under the truck and sped the truck out of fear of what just happened and stopped the truck. He said he kept on driving the truck for an hour and stopped after crossing 2 villages to check the truck for damage or marks of the accident and spent the night wide awake and shivering inside the truck itself. He then went back to the village the next morning to check if something had happened and asked a few locals if there had been an accident. Now here's the scary part, that no one had heard of any accident. The place where the accident took place was about 3 to 4 kilometers from the village, and if something like that had happened then surely locals would have known about it. Then one of the locals asked my dad if he was talking about the 3 men on the bicycle, to which he said yes. He local said that he must have seen the ghosts of the young men who were actually crushed to death a few years back when they were returning from work late from a nearby factory. After hearing this, my dad said he sat there for 15 minutes holding his head. He still gets goosebumps telling the story. Not a truck driver, but I was doing mission work in Uganda, East Africa, and I was in the passenger seat with my Ugandan friend Michael driving home early in the morning. I remember, around 4 a.m., it was still dark. And we came across the wreck of a bus that had recently crashed. The people had off the bus, and the front of the bus looked like something out of a Transformers movie. The front had been ripped open like claws had taken it and ripped it apart. It was surreal. The people had a look in their eyes like they had seen a ghost. There was no way the driver had survived. We didn't see a body, but the passenger's eyes said it all. It looked as though the front of the bus had hit a semi from behind, and that's what ripped the front apart. Not a truck driver, but I live in a small town in the mountains. There's a lot of meth/drugs in the area, so this could have been why, but one night me and my friends were picking up their dad from an unsure area for the above-mentioned reasons. A random trailer in the woods. Anyways, it was probably around midnight, in winter in the pouring rain, and we were driving back out to the main road that goes through town, and we pass a woman alone standing about 2 feet in our lane, just standing there staring. Not at us, but past us. Jet black hair, no shoes, and wearing what looked like a white nightgown. And I know I wasn't weird cause all 4 of us seen her, and their dad says, "Oh, did you see that woman? We should give her a ride," and every one of us immediately responded, "No, he didn't see what she looked like / what was going on, he just seen a woman last second standing in BFE in the pouring rain." I drove a limo for a while instead of a truck, and also tend to prefer to drive at night anyway, especially for my trips that go over 100 miles out into the middle of nowhere, so I have seen some weird things. One that stands out to me most, because I have no idea what was going on. I once drove under an overpass on 205 in California around 1 a.m. or so. On top of the overpass, I saw 3 black cars parked in delta formation. I think they were Hondas, I'm not sure though. The point being, they were midline cars instead of anything extravagant. The hood of one of the cars was a briefcase. All 3 cars had their lights on, illuminating the overpass, and about 10 feet in front of the cars were 3 to 5 men in black suits. About 15 feet past them was one guy wearing a white blazer. It looked like the setup for a standoff in an action flick, and I was desperately hoping to watch this guy run forward and start kicking people in the face. Unfortunately, none of them moved for the 10 seconds or so I was aware of them and able to see them. If anyone has heard anything, let me know. Do you want the one about hallucinating rabbits or the UFO? Wow. Got up this morning and found this had exploded. Let me get woke and some breakfast and update. P.S. Thanks for the interest. Update, hallucinating rabbits. I had just started my career as a professional driver, and I was going through my OJT. My trainer said I was somewhere in the southwest US, in the middle of the night. I'm driving and he's in the bunk. I have never been able to sleep in a moving vehicle, and I hadn't gotten good sleep for 3 to 4 weeks. It's a dark, lonely, 2-lane US highway. Then I saw a rabbit run out into the road and I ran over it. Kinda sad. Then about 200 feet later I saw another. And a few hundred feet later I ran over 2 more. I have heard about population explosions of mice, rats, and jackrabbits around the world. And I wasn't stupid enough to put my life or the life of my trainer, or the equipment in danger trying to avoid hitting rabbits. And over the next half hour or so I saw hundreds of rabbits run out and get run over by my truck. My trainer didn't allow smoking in the sleeper, so he came out and sat in the passenger seat for a smoke. I started telling him about all the rabbits, and I said, "There's one. There's another. And two more." He looks at me and says, "Dude, there's nothing out there." I immediately realized that I was hallucinating from lack of sleep. So, I grabbed some brakes, downshifted, and pulled over onto a wide spot on the side of the road. I shut the truck down and grabbed my logbook and started closing it out. He's telling me we can't stop because we'll be late for the delivery. I very calmly told him that I was hallucinating, and now he knows that too. I tell him that I'm not jeopardizing my life, his life, or the equipment, and that I'm going to bed. Sometime later I woke him by getting the truck down the road to the delivery. In the morning, I'm supervising the unloading and he disappears. He comes back and tells me to go call the driver manager. The DM just asks what happened, and I tell him. He basically says that I did the right thing, but I completed my OJT and have been a successful truck driver for 21 years now. Update, UFO incident. I was a new driver still going through OJT. I don't remember if this took place before or after the hallucinating rabbit story, I suspect before. But my trainer and I were going through the southwest US, and we saw a sign for Roswell, New Mexico, site of the famous UFO incident. We start talking about UFOs like guys do. We are both relating our beliefs and experiences. I saw an unidentified flying object when I was in the army, with 10 other guys. I'm driving, my trainer is in the passenger seat. I look out my window and see a cigar-shaped light following along beside us, couldn't tell how far away. My heart skipped several beats, my breathing froze, and my stomach was threatening to erupt out of my throat. I couldn't speak but had to get my trainer's attention to show him the UFO. I looked to the right and started to frantically wave and point, when I noticed he had his reading light on. It was square, but at this angle it looked cigar-shaped. Boy did I feel silly. I finally regained my senses and told him what I thought I saw. We both had a good laugh. I hope you all enjoy it. After a nice weekend of snowboarding, we were driving back from the mountains between Golden and Field, British Columbia, and there are these military trucks all along the highway. As we're passing them, I see this massive cannon pointed up at the mountains and signs saying, "Highway closed." We are not prepared to spend another night away from home, but luckily they wave us through. The weather had gotten pretty bad and created perfect conditions for avalanches in that area, so they were preparing to trigger them before they could do any severe damage. So, if you're ever thinking about joining the Canadian military, know that they are snow fighters keeping us all safe. Not a truck driver, but I do have a creepy driving story. A few years ago, my husband and I were on a road trip through Croatia, and we were driving in the middle of the night through a rural area to get to our hotel. We were driving through a small, dark neighborhood when we saw a giant black dog sitting in the street directly in our path. This thing seemed like it was as big as a bear. He was just sitting in the road. Non-blinking, non-moving. Just very stoic. Being an animal lover, I started to roll down the window to talk to the dog, but my husband was like, "Nope. Not today, demon dog," and sped off before I could get my window down in time. I was like, "Okay, weirdo." A few days later we drove through the same neighborhood on our way back home, and we saw that same dog, but in the front yard this time, only it wasn't the same at all. It was a medium-sized old dog and he wagged his tail at us as we drove by. It was 100% the same house though. So of course, we googled black demon dogs and discovered that lore does exist and that demons will take the shape of a known animal or something like that. So, demon dog. Used to drive vans long distances. Waking up directly behind a semi at a truck stop/rest area, asleep in the driver's seat, can really freak you out the first time. Was also driving into Phoenix one night for leisure and was driving down a highway around 8 p.m. and no one was there. The only other car I saw for 30 minutes was a police officer passing me with its lights on. We stopped to camp at a campground around there that was also nearly deserted and creepy, and it happened to decline our cards a couple times. We got the hint that we weren't welcome and went closer to Phoenix looking for a hotel. We came in from the east and I think it was a state park with a lone lake. It was a two-way highway, but I can't remember the name of the town or park. Both were eerily quiet as hell. Nothing was open and no one was out at all. I was driving from northern Illinois to northern Minnesota. Somewhere in Wisconsin or Minnesota when the highway was just 2 lanes I came across a makeshift roadblock. It was around 9 p.m. and I was an hour or 2 from my destination, but the roadblock was a broken down car and then came in the middle of the road blocking my passage. I went up to it and stopped and a guy was waiting for me and started getting towards my car. I was just freaked out, so I sped off. Something was so off about it. About 19 years back I was teen driving with another driver. It was late, sometime around midnight. We headed west across Arizona somewhere on I-40. He was driving, and I was up front talking with him. We both saw this bright point of light zoom straight up, turn at a 90-degree angle, zoom in that direction, turn straight up again, and after a few moments of zooming it disappeared into this giant ball of diffused light that took up most of the night sky. We are both sitting there stunned, looking at it, looking at each other, looking at it, and looking back at each other. At the same time, we both went, nope, not going to say it. We heard later it was a rocket launch, but an awful weird flight path. So, I'm not a trucker, but I heard this story from someone. Basically, there is this road, I don't remember where, but a lot of truckers try to avoid it because a woman there was murdered by a trucker, and now oftentimes whenever a trucker is driving through the area they swear the woman will jump in front of their truck and make them get in a wreck or something. The details are kind of fuzzy, and it was probably just a ghost story though I would love if anyone could verify it. This is from my brother who told me this a couple years back. So he was in San Diego and it was getting late and he stopped at a truck stop. As he's getting ready for bed someone starts banging at the passenger side door yelling "Give me the money" at the top of his lungs. My brother grabs a gun from the drawer and walks over to the door. As soon as he makes eye contact the man turns and goes away. He hasn't stopped there since. Not a trucker but was driving alone on a country backroad in Ohio one weekend night, heading to a party about an hour away. I was having an enjoyable time, listening to some music when I saw a car in front of me going slow, straddling the shoulder line. I stayed behind it briefly to see if he would take off, but he didn't, so I passed and looked into the driver's side but didn't see anyone there. As soon as I passed the car flicks on the high beams and tears ass, catching up to me and starts riding my bumper. I speed up since I was already creeped out only to see he is matching my speed and now flicking his high beams. I'm going about 80 now and he's still matching my speed. I pulled out my phone, have 911 dialed, and as soon as I decided to call, I looked back and there were no lights. I'm a FedEx delivery driver and I guess I can be called a truck driver as I drive one. Anyways. On my last route I had to drive on a dirt road that passed by an abandoned museum. This place looks creepy, especially when the first thing that you see is a 20 feet eyeless Santa falling apart. Next to it was a broken down house that was my delivery. It wasn't out of the ordinary to deliver to places like this, because usually it was next to a more intact house. I was unsure of this place being the right place. I walked to the front door to ask the owner if he expected a delivery. I saw a pale white man who I thought was the owner and asked him if it was the right place. He turned around a corner and I thought he didn't hear me and walked towards him. When I turned the corner where he walked, he was gone. I thought that even though it was creepy not hearing a door close, I walked back to my truck only to be greeted by many mangled and desecrated stuffed animals and characters tied up to trees. I said screw this and got off that road. I like to tell that story to people. My father is a truck driver and one day his truck went up in flames. Apparently, the gas had a breach and somehow it went up in flames. He only had time to take his phone and leave the truck ASAP. He lost some clothes, but fortunately, he wasn't harmed. The road was almost empty, so fortunately nobody was harmed, just the poor truck. Truck driver related, but not creepy. My grandparents went to Alaska in the mid-90s and they saw a truck accident where a bull moose charged the truck during their rut and wedged its antlers in the trailer. The moose hit the trailer with such force it died on impact. It was basically standing there dead stuck into the trailer. Another story, my friend's brother was driving truck down in the States and was sitting in traffic down in Pittsburgh on the phone with his mother stopped when some African American man hopped in his truck. Apparently, the guy was trying to get him to drive somewhere, so he stayed on the phone and kept calm, and eventually the guy hopped back out when they stopped again. He's not sure if the guy was disturbed or what, because the guy never pulled a weapon or acted aggressively, he was just persistent on going somewhere. Turns out the company he drove knew the passenger lock was in trouble, so you can imagine how he was about that. My dad was driving a truck in Johannesburg in the 90s and happened upon a bank robbery. As the thieves ran from the bank, they crossed the road directly in front of my dad. At that moment, the police officers opened up with automatic weapons, filling my dad's vehicle with bullet holes. One passed through the passenger seat, which thankfully was empty. It was very scary when my dad arrived home, bleeding from shattered glass and talking about getting shot at. I wasn't employed as a truck driver at the time, but once I was driving on the highway, not far from my hometown, when I came upon a fierce rain shower. It had been drying before that, but since a neighboring town had a rainy forecast, it wasn't surprising. Then, hundreds, maybe thousands of frogs dotted the road ahead, who were often out in the wet, but this was an absurd amount of them. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning cracked into the forest, so close that the thunder was simultaneous, and both the frogs and the rain let up, leaving dry roads ahead of me. It came on and left just as if nature itself had sneezed. Once driving the backroads of rural Ireland at 0200, I saw what I swore was a black SUV coming straight for me, and I swerved to avoid it. I continued my route, and then 2 years later I was out near that area again. I picked up a newspaper in a local shop and saw the same black SUV had crashed into a hedge. 3 people were killed. It haunts me to this day. UPS driver incoming. 4 weeks ago, I was doing bike shipping runs from the local DS along the highway near Bozeman, Montana. It was 12 p.m. and it had been a long day, no cars on the highway whatsoever. Until around 1:30, a black pickup truck started driving alongside my van. Creeped out, I slowed down to let it have some room, but it slowed down as well. When I made it to the exit, it followed, right alongside me, close to 40 minutes right up to the drop-off point. Probably not important, but God knows what the guy inside was thinking, and the windows were tinted, so I have no idea who the person was. To think that if I'd pulled a hard shoulder or fallen asleep at the wheel, he could have robbed my truck. One of my good friends from high school was in OTR for 2 years. Stopped in rural Arizona this past winter to get some rest as he put in a 10-hour day. Locks up his truck and goes to bed. In the middle of the night, he hears a noise underneath his mattress. There's a mechanical hatch in that location that opens, and he hears something shuffling about. He grabs his gun and flashlight. Turns out somebody was trying to steal his truck. He puts the gun to the intruder's head and states the following: "Give me one good reason why I shouldn't pull the trigger." True story. Not a trucker story, but I have one, and it's pretty sad. My dad was in the army, won't mention which country for security reasons, and was on vacation. We were at a beach 600 kilometers from base, and he was due to return the next morning for a briefing. As we were driving back, a small storm passed by. Now this is where it gets interesting. We lived in a stormy region, so this wasn't unusual, except that exactly one tree got uprooted and fell in our path. We could have taken a detour and been on our way anyway, but my mom and dad said they saw a black cat meowing on top of the fallen tree. Except my mom claimed it was saying die in our language and dad claimed it was saying mother. Now my mom is pretty superstitious with this stuff, so can't vouch for her, and the road had no lights, so I couldn't exactly see from the back seat as I was lying sideways. Except my dad is pretty strong-willed, and even he insisted we had to go see his parents, my grandparents, immediately. They lived in a small town nearby. It wasn't unusual for us to stop over during long travels, so they were happy to have us. Next morning, we found out something horrible happened at the briefing Dad didn't go to. A couple of soldiers mutinied and murdered nearly all the officers there. It was an internal terrorist attack and a handful of officers escaped with their lives. The nation was in shock and went into a state of emergency for 3 days. My dad could have been among the dead. He lost many of his batchmates and colleagues. Life was honestly never the same again. But it could have been worse had it not been for the tree and the cat. Ever since then I've focused much more on religion because, man, even if God doesn't exist or it's the wrong God, there is something playing with our lives, and I'd rather be safe and be on his good side so he can let it slide for a little longer when my time comes. You can laugh all you want, but I'm as much of a man of science as it gets, and this I'll still 100% stick to. Oh, and the fallen tree? Nowhere to be found by the road cleanup crew. As if it never existed, although it could have been blown into the sea for all we know. Not a truck driver, but I think this story fits the mood. Me and my family every summer go to an exceedingly small coastal town on the very south of the province of Buenos Aires, Argentina, to spend a month on the beach. Mind you, this is an exceedingly small town. Roads made of dirt, and downtown consists of a couple of blocks with stores. Very rural and unpopulated. Even though in summer the population rises quite a bit, it's pretty eerie. On one side you have a vast empty beach with maybe 600 yards of bathing allowed zones with tents and lifeguards, and the rest is just empty, and on the other side miles and miles of farmland. Also, the beaches had a huge dune range filled with tamarisks that separated it from the town. The thing is, I took a job to guard the beach at night, so that drunk teenagers didn't get into the sea and drown. It happened before. I had to cover one of the peripheries of the town's beach from like 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. I had a small cottage on one of the dunes, a flashlight, and a laser. This cottage was right next to the road that came onto the beach, so usually people came through there. If they didn't, since it was pitch black, I had to just try and look and the coastline for people. In this road there usually were some vehicles parked because of nighttime fishers that had allowance. One night at like 4 a.m., to one of the far sides of the beach, quite far away, I see some torch-like lights coming out from behind a dune. I thought it was just a group of friends at the beginning, but increased torches appeared, and soon it was like a huge line of torchlight. Yellow flickering spots in the darkness, and they were coming towards me. No need to say I was scared to hell and stayed inside the cabin. I just stayed there watching them come closer until I recognized human shapes. It was like maybe 30 people, most of them with torches coming out from one of the dunes outside of the town's boundaries. When they were closer, I saw they were all wearing Amish-like clothes and pointy hats. There were children as well, walking, grabbing the hand of some of the adults. They got onto the street and got on some big van vehicles that were parked there and left. I swear to God, I don't know what that was. Husband, night shift, driving a snowplow in the forest in northern CA, gets tired and pulls off 2-lane road to get a little nap in. Wakes up to a guy on running board, looking in window. My husband is creeped out easily but also kind of crazy, so he rolls down window and guy say his car broke down. The husband says he will drive him into town, 20 miles. On the way the guy seems off and at one point rolls down truck window and throws his car keys into a snowbank. Now he's realizing he shouldn't have let him into the truck. The guy just started saying crazy, and luckily by that time they were approaching town and he let him off at 7 to 11. Which is where someone else's story just began. 7 to 11, 2 a.m. I was in this town right in the middle of a forest, middle of the night, and some truck driver stops and out steps this weird guy.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.